Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah thumma ma ba'd. In this reflection, we want to talk about Taqlid, literacy, and Islamic education overall, and the role that these concepts play in regards to the Quran and the Sunnah. Taqlid as an institution has come under much critique, and rightly so, given that in the latter part of Islamic history, many aspects of Taqlid have become detrimental. When disassociated from the institution of scholarship, with Taqlid within the context of Islamic scholarship, within the context of Islamic education, as a means, an initial means to gain literacy, is an institution which is essential to the growth of the Muslim mind. There are some reasons for this position, and that's that Taqlid, as it is understood by the ulama, not as it is practiced by the average Muslim, but as it is understood in the books of Usul al-Fiqh, is a starting point for gaining an understanding or learning. So that we follow someone and we imitate that person and we master a body of knowledge that's being communicated to us. And then from there we can begin to grow. The concept of bringing critical thought to the learning process at the initial stages of learning has proven itself to be very problematic. At first, we have to become familiar with an idea or concept before being able to critique. But the mindset which initially wants to critique before understanding undermines itself from the very beginning, because there's no foundation to establish itself upon. Taqlid then is a tool, is a means to an end, and not an end in itself. And this is the problem that we have seen and we continue to see in the Muslim community, is that Taqlid is treated as an end in itself. Islamic literacy demands that our understanding of Islam itself gain maturity and has the ability to deal with contemporary realities. Taqlid then always has to be associated with the institution of Islamic scholarship. And if it is not associated with Islamic scholarship, it becomes a dead end, because you're talking about people following other people without understanding the logic, the rationale, the premises and evidences that found or that ground their thinking. And because Islamic scholarship in many cases has fallen into disarray as far as an institution of learning is concerned, many institutions face challenges to maintain themselves, to maintain authority as far as persuasive ability is concerned, as far as influence is concerned. Have fallen into a disarray in the sense that we don't find the funding that's necessary for these institutions to grow, and therefore we find a deficiency in the ability of these institutions to be robust because they lack funding. So Taqlid then by itself is not an end. Taqlid has to be looked upon as a means to an end, At first, we aim to understand. We follow because we aim to understand. Then we grow into mature thinking about what it is that we just studied. There has to be a trust factor here. And this is why taking your knowledge from those you trusted becomes important. Because essentially, when you begin to learn something, you are engaging in taqlid. You're not sure whether that which you're learning is sound or unsound unless you have developed the capabilities to discern. In today's time, it has become more popular to promote the idea of ittiba'. And the idea of ittiba', it's a middle position between taqlid and ijtihad. Ijtihad is the ability of a person to research the Quran and the Sunnah independent of the research that has been put forward by others. Ittiba' is to follow someone with understanding the evidences that they're using, and to some extent understanding the reasoning and the logic that goes behind the position that they construct. When we look at the da'wah to the Quran and the Sunnah, people calling others to the Quran and the Sunnah, what we fail to see is people understanding how to work with the Quran and the Sunnah. They tend to look at Islamic scholarship as something which is not necessary. And they feel the confidence to be able to go to the Quran and the Sunnah directly and to interpret without mediation, without an intermediary, without someone guiding them in the process. The problem with their understanding is that in the time of the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, one of the distinctive points about their time period was that they were grounded in the Arabic language. So there was no need to study the Arabic language in the way that we study the Arabic language or in the way that the scholars before us studied the Arabic language. They understood the Arabic language. There was no need to study the Arabic language. There was no need to study its principles, its grammar, its morphology, its rhetoric, its usages. There was no need to delve into the meaning of obscure words. These things were there present with these people because they had mastery over the language that they employed when communicating. So therefore there was no need to understand the Arabic language. There was no problem in hadith during the time period. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was a living force, a living educator. He was there present, and revelation was descending. So there was no necessity to study the sciences of hadith in the way that we study, or in the way that the ulama studied in the past. In fact, the ulama in the past, when we find the likes of Bukhari and others, may Allah have mercy on them, they studied hadith in such a way that even ourselves in our time period, we have difficulty in studying. And that they memorized thousands of hadith, so that we have the position of hafiz in hadith sciences, denoting someone who has memorized 100,000 plus hadith. We have the title of Amir al-Mu'mineen in hadith, which denotes or designates a person which has reached one of the highest ranks, the peaks in the study of hadith. When we look at the reality today, the prowess in memory and even the familiarity with Islamic texts is lacking. But this was not the case in the earlier generations. We find that even in the time of the Sahaba themselves, the knowledge of the Sunnah was not collected in one place as we find among the later day scholars. So that the later day scholars become essential even to understand the understanding of the companions themselves. And some say that we should understand the Quran and the Sunnah with the understanding of the companions. Well, one will pose the question, after agreeing with that statement, how do we get to an understanding of the Sahaba's comprehension of the Quran and the Sunnah, if not by way of the ulama, the scholars who came after them? So The crisis that we face today is one of methodology. But beyond that, the crisis is more fundamental. The crisis that we face is the lack of strong Islamic educational institutions which can groom scholarship, cultivate it, and communicate it, so that the community of Muslims then becomes a community that's literate. We may find people with PhDs and MDs, etc., etc., but the reality is that literacy in the Muslim community is deficient. There's a deficit in Islamic literacy. And this idea has been promoted by a number of scholars here in the West, such as Dr. Shimon Jackson and others. And this is the point that those who are involved in da'wah should promote. The idea of developing a level of literacy in the Muslim community which will allow people to have a mature understanding. But when people come to understand the deen, individually, independently, and without the guidance of scholars, we see that they fall into erroneous positions. And we're not talking here about whether a person is from the people of bid'ah, or from the people of kufr, or ignorant, and so on and so forth. We're not talking about differentiating between sects. We're not talking about declaring someone to be a Muslim or non-Muslim. We're talking about the reality that there are basics that are missing in our understanding. Basics which are fundamental to Islamic education and to reaching a mature position in the deen as far as comprehension is concerned. So Islamic education then had a structure in the past. And that structure needs to be respected in order to understand how to move forward. There's a fundamental element missing even today in Islamic education, and that's the grooming or cultivating of manners. In the past, it was intolerable for a student of knowledge to be a person devoid of manners. Today, a person can be one which will have familiarity with hadith because of the facility of access that's afforded to us by the internet, and then be one which defames others, be one which undermines others, the status of others. And we even find that people are being produced within our systems of learning in which they carry a deep deficiency spiritually and in their social skills. In some senses, this is no fault of their own, but this is a problem that we have in our educational institutions, that they don't address the whole of the person while at the same time addressing contemporary realities. This is not to say that there are no efforts being made to reform our educational institutions, but this is a general problem which there may be some exceptions to the rule. So if we want to gain an understanding of how to approach the Quran and the Sunnah, we have to look at the periods of fiqh and how they developed, to understand how it is that different conditions and circumstances appeared which called for different realities to present themselves in order to support and aid us. So when we look and we see at the time of the companions as mentioned, there was no necessity for them to study the sciences of hadith. If they lacked in the knowledge of a particular hadith, they congregated together and asked about the knowledge of the Sunnah. And this was the methodology that they had until about the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And after the time of Uthman, the leading companions scattered across the Muslim world and took with them the knowledge of the Sunnah. And therefore, during the time of Umar Abdul Aziz and others after him, the knowledge of the Sunnah began to be consolidated, collected again, and then systematized. It's not that the knowledge of the Sunnah was lost, it's that the knowledge of the Sunnah needed to be codified, systematized, and communicated in a way in which people would understand clearly what is the Sunnah from what is not the Sunnah. So these are things that did not exist during the time of the companions. There was no need to study the Arabic language. There was no need to study sciences of hadith in depth. And in fact, we find that many of the problems that the later Ummah faced and the Ummah faces today, some of these problems were not even thought of or considered in the time of the companions. So then there became a necessity to address these new situations from the Quran and the Sunnah and from the instructions or research of the ulama of the past. And therefrom, fiqh developed and began to address various situations. So what we're lacking then is an understanding of our own history, an understanding of the value of the scholarship of the Muslims or the Muslim scholars, and an appreciation for their effort. And without having this appreciation and respect and understanding of their efforts, we will always fall into methodological problems. And given the fact that our mosques are not centers of learning as they were in the past, we will always fall short when it comes to learning. Therefore, we have to look at the importance of building Islamic educational institutions which are capable of addressing the needs of the age and not just regurgitating the thoughts of the past. We need also to understand that knowledge comes in stages, and we also need to understand that not everything within popular consciousness is correct. And that goes to say that Taqlid has both positives and negative aspects. And many times what we find ourselves is either fighting for one position or another without approaching the manner in balance, nor approaching the manner according to how it is understood in Islamic sciences or in Islamic learning. Because our understanding today is mostly cultural, and because we're fighting for cultural practices to be preserved, in many ways we're scared of revisiting ideas that we think to be clear. And as long as we follow the Quran and the Sunnah, and as long as we respect the consensus of the Ummah of the past and the present, and as long as we follow the principles of the Arabic language, as long as we follow the principles of Usul al-Fiqh, as long as we negotiate with the rules of Islamic scholarship, respecting the sciences of Hadith and so on and so forth, then we will have no problem. But first, we have to begin at some point. And that point of learning is that we have to submit ourselves, humble ourselves to beginning our studies at the basic level and then growing from there. We don't humble ourselves. We don't establish a foundation in our learning and in our understanding. There's no way that we're going to gain a solid understanding of Islam. Therefore, the knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah at the basic level or at the basic understanding demands that we memorize. To interpret the Quran and the Sunnah demands that we gain in the principles of Islamic scholarship. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.